G'day, this is Andrew Price here from blenderguru.com, and in this video tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to create this image right here. So of course we're going to be using Blender's built-in fluid simulator, and we're going to be dropping in some virtual fruit into a virtual tank of water. So this is sort of a take on a popular photography method. A lot of photographers like to do it. They drop fruit into stuff and then they take photos of it. In fact, they drop all sorts of stuff into everything, and they create what's called, I think it's splash photography. I think it's even got a name. And it looks cool because I guess, you know, although the naked eye sees a lot of splashes, you rarely ever get to see the detail. So when you use a camera and you can photograph that exact moment when a splash happens, it looks very interesting and it's very appealing to the viewer. So this is essentially using 3D software to mimic that effect and give you a lot more control over it. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. Although the fluid simulator can be a little bit frustrating at times, it is overall a lot of fun. So there's not really any rocket science to the fluid simulator. I've essentially just been working on this over the last week and a half, or probably about a week. These are some of the original images that I started with. I originally was going to make this a topography tutorial using logos and stuff, so I experimented with that. I was going to make it an animation, but as you can see, it didn't really turn out all that great. You can see that the bubbles start to peel away very easily, and I thought, I don't know if that's really going to work. I tried it with a light up logo. This one you can see right here. And you can see the varying different levels of effects and stuff you can get. But essentially, this whole process was just trying out different fluid settings and just seeing how it works. So if you've never used the fluid simulator before, it takes a while to bake things. So it's a really good learning technique. You just set up something, try some different settings, and then you bake it, and then you see how it goes. So these are some of the images that I went with. I was experimenting. Here we go, getting into some fruit, some lemons, and some limes until I finally landed upon this final image that you can see right there. So I'll show you the finished, what the finished scene looks like. It's this one. You can see right here, it's just a big tank of water. It goes really slow moving around here because there is a lot of polys right there. Underneath all that, we've got 3 pieces of fruit with some particles that are peeling off it. So I'll show you how to model an orange, just to give you sort of a, you know, fruit introduction, I guess. It's not really part of the tutorial, so I'll sort of speed over that. But then we'll get into some particles as well to create these little fake air bubbles there, just to give it a little bit more appeal. And then of course the big old fluid simulator as well. So go ahead and download the starter file for this project. Now the starter file, it's got these 3 pieces of fruit in it. However, I'm going to show you very quickly now how to model an orange, because I know some people like to learn these things and other people just want to get to the meat of it. So I'll show you very quickly now modeling an orange as quickly as we can. So it's really simple. We're just going to add in a UV sphere like this, and we want to UV unwrap it because we're going to be adding in some bump mapping to get the kind of the nice effects, the little dimples and stuff over the orange. So I'm just going to select those 2 seams like that, and then I'm going to hit, what am I going to select? Nope, not extrude. Oh dear, I forgot what I'm doing. Oh, Control E, there we go. Mark seam, okay? So selecting mark seam, you can see it's got a red line around it. Then I'm just going to split this view right here. I'm going to hit U, unwrap, and I'm just going to scale that up to be about there. We don't need to put an image there because we're actually going to be using procedural textures. Okay, so then going over to the material panel right here, I'm going to add a new material to it, and I'm just going to leave that set as diffuse. Now I'm going to split this view, go into the node editor, and this is where I'm going to have a lot more control over the material. So the first thing I want to do is to get that nice sort of dimply ripple, bump effect. We're essentially trying to mimic the look of an orange skin, okay? I guess we should turn on smooth shading for this. I'm also going to add in a subsurf modifier as well. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to add in some lighting just so that we can see how this looks as we're creating it. It's always good to see what's happening. Okay, like that. And I'll just give this an emitter. Oh, I made the orange an emitter. Okay, that wasn't right. Make that diffuse. And make the light emitter, set that to 5. Alright. Okay, cool. So what I want to do now is to add in that bump map. So we're going to be using a Voronoi texture. So go ahead and add that in. And I want to set the scaling for this to be about 400. And then we also want to set the vector. So it needs to be using the UV texture vector thing. Now, I think previously in earlier versions of Blender, by default it set it as UV, but anyway, now I actually have to set it. So I'm going to go texture coordinates, and I'm just going to set that to UV, just like that. Plug that in there. So that was input texture coordinate, by the way, if you missed that. And now I'm going to add in a mix node, drop this into the bottom input, set this to be multiply. I'm going to leave the top blank, but I'm going to set it as pure white, just like that. This is how you do bump mapping, by the way, if you weren't aware. And then I just take that output of that multiply node and I put that into the displacement right there. And voila, you can see you've now got some bump mapping. And if I wanted to get even more fancy, which we should, I suppose, I'm going to invert it like that. And now you can see you've got the bumps that are sort of going in the right direction. And you can change how much bump mapping you want by turning down that multiply factor amount, just like that. And so although that's not perfect, it's pretty good for procedural textures. Now if you wanted to, you can actually duplicate this Voronoi texture, set this to be a scale of 140, and then add in a mix node, like so. Whoops. Take the output of that, put that in there. Set that multiply, oh yeah, change this mix type to be multiply. Then take the output of that UV node and then put it in there like that. And now that's going to give you some more sort of bigger, chunkier, I don't know how to say it, bigger bumps and stuff like that. So actually, let's try screen. I'm not sure which one it is supposed to be. I think screen might be right. Yeah, that would make sense. And if you want, you can turn that down if it's too much as well. I might set that to 0.3 or something like that. But that's essentially it. That is that's the sort of the bump mapping of the orange. And then if you want to give it some color, which I'm assuming you do, going to give that a nice orange color like that. Turn the brightness all the way up to 1, or that slider all the way up to the top. And then you got the basic skin of it. Now, this should be there should be some shine to this. So if you wanted to make it shiny, then all you do is add in a glossy node. Drop this in right here, then go to shader, then mix shader. Make sure it's not a mix node, but it's a mix shader node. Drop that in right there, then take the output of the glossy node, put it in there, and now we've got some shininess to it. You don't want it to be too shiny, of course, so maybe turn that down to about there, and you can turn down the sort of how much reflectivity you want that orange to have, sort of how clear you want that, and you can sort of experiment with those results. I think the bump mapping is a little bit too much as well. But you get the gist of it. So that is the basic material of that. Now there's a little bit of modeling to do as well if you want to create that top part of the orange. So I'm just going to go hit O, and this is going to go into proportional editing. And now I'm just going to move this down slightly, just like that. And I'm going to grab this ring of vertices right there, and I'm going to scale that in, and then I'm going to pull that one in there as well. You could create another edge loop here, which I think I might do actually. Might give it a little bit better of a look. Another one there as well. You could fix up the UV mapping if you wanted to, but I'm not really going to worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. And now I'm just going to select about 5 sort of seams along here, just like this. 2, 3. Okay, so that's 4, and then I'll create another one right there. And then I'm just going to move that down just like that. So you can see what we're doing now. We're just creating that top part of the orange. And then I'm just going to go into top view mode. And I'm just going to unselect those ones right there. And then I'm going to move those up slightly, just so that it's sort of fading off a little bit. And you can see the sort of effect it has. And then to create that stem, it's pretty easy. I'm just going to duplicate that ring right there. I'm going to make it a separate object by hitting P. I'm going to select that. Let's go Control-Alt-Shift-C. The most awkward key combination ever. Then select origin to geometry, and then if I just extrude that inwards like that, then up, and then create a face. Let's go like so, and you might have to, of course, recalculate those normals because it's all been screwed up. Nope. So this is obviously a very basic introduction to creating an orange. I really only wanted to show it to you because I know some of you might want to be creating some different types of fruit, or I don't know, you want to sort of feel as though, you know, you're not starting with a starter file. I know some people, myself included, when I'm doing a tutorial, I don't like to start with somebody else's work. I like to do everything from scratch. So for those people, I'm just giving you a very basic look at creating an orange. So this is the stem right here. I'm just going to give this a very dark green color like that, something around about that. That's diffuse as well. If you want to change the viewport color, just select that little eyedropper tool there and then select that. Might do the same for the orange as well. That way it's sort of easier to tell in the 3D viewport what you're looking at. You can add some more detail to that stem if you like. But that's basically it. There is actually one more thing if you wanted to give the orange a little bit more realism. You don't want it to all be exactly the same one color. So what I'm going to do is just add in a noise texture right here. And I'm going to add a mix node in, change this type to be overlay. And then I'm going to drag the output of that noise texture into the bottom input there, and then put this into the diffuse right there. The color has now completely changed, but I'm just going to make this now the color of my orange. So just changing that like that. And you can see you've now got some slight pinkish and different colors happening in that orange. So it's not all the same color. And the lower you set this to, then the less of that variation color is going to be showing through. But it does help to have little things like that. Can just make it go from looking average to looking more realistic. So you can see the difference it's made, and it looks quite cool. And also one other thing as well, if you wanted to add a displacement modifier. Whoops, what happened there? All right, there we go. Just like that. And this is just going to give it a little bit more variation. So this is the texture panel. If you want to change the displacement, just go change that type to displacement right there, and then you can change sort of the rippling of that orange, because you don't want it all to look exactly the same. Oranges aren't completely symmetrical. They've got little bumps and nooks and crannies and stuff happening. So this is just essentially just replicating that type of effect very quickly with very, very minimal modeling. Anyway, you can experiment with that. But that's the gist of it, guys. I'm sure you get the hang of it. So if you want to go ahead now and create those 3 other fruit, so on this last layer here, if you've downloaded the file, I've got a lime, I've got a lemon which is sliced, and that lemon, by the way, has just got this image, if I can find it, that one right there. So that is off CG Texture, so you'll have to download that if you wanted to use that. But you can see the fruit are very basic, and that is the gist of it. So without further ado, let's get into the rest of the tutorial. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and delete my orange right here. You can keep yours if you want, but I've already created 3 over here that are ready to go, so it's all good and fine. Okay, so now we can finally get into the fluid simulation. So if you've never used the fluid simulator before, for any simulator to work, the first thing you need is a domain box. So the domain box is essentially just a cube. So if we add a cube in right here, and this cube will act as the boundary box for the simulation. So all of the water simulation is going to be happening inside this box right here. So you want to make it as small as possible, because the larger you make the box, then the more fluid bake time you'll have to wait for. But you also want to make it large enough that the sides of the boundary box aren't visible for the shot. So I'm just going to scale this up right here so that it fits all of our fruit into it. And I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm just going to move that cube upwards like that, just so that origin point is in place right there, so it's on the grid floor. And then I'm going to exit the edit mode like that. Now is actually a good time to be positioning the camera, because a lot of the sizing of this boundary box right here is going to be defined by what the camera can see. So if I just go to the layer 1 over here, and I just grab the camera, and then if I go into front view, then hit Control Alt number pad 0, and that's going to snap the camera to that location right there. Now I'm just going to change some of these camera parameters, I guess. So I'm going to change the camera preset to be a Canon 7D. And that just changes this sensor width information, so you can see it looks kind of zoomed in a little bit more now. I'm not sure if that changes too much on how the actual image looks when it's rendered, or if it's just purely for camera tracking. But anyway, I like to fiddle with these presets because they're kind of fun. And the focal length, I'm going to make that 90. Which, as you can see, is really zoomed in. But I found that it looks nicer because instead of having that, sort of three-dimensional feel with lots of stuff happening and a foreground and a background and stuff like that, having a high focal length allows it to focus on just sort of one part, and you can see that it's very clean, very cut, and all you're seeing is the fluid, and I found it looked a little bit nicer, so that's why I'm using a focal length of 90. And also I found that photographers, if they're going to be photographing splash effects and stuff like that, often the camera is far away from where it's happening because obviously they don't want to get water on the camera, so it's sort of a little bit more realistic that way as well. Okay, so positioning this camera right here, I'm just going to move this to be about there. So you can see that this is the boundary box of our domain, the fluid domain. So provided that the camera is not so far out that you can see the edges of the box like that, it should be fine. Now then you want to scale down the height of the box because if you've got it too high, then it's just going to be wasting a lot of space. And I think you can also scale it. Actually, I'll leave the width of it like that. That should be fine. You get some ripples and stuff like that. But scaling that down to be about there. But yeah, just leaving a lot of room at the top there, just so that the splash can sort of splash upwards without it looking as though it's just hit the ceiling of something. So that's why we've got that. And so now that we've got the boundary box, the next step, of course, is to add in the fluid object itself. So this is just, as you can imagine, if it's a fish tank, this is just the glass shell. So now you actually need some water in there. So I'm just going to duplicate that cube right there, and I'm just going to scale that down just slightly, looking at this right here, just like that. And then I'm going to scale that to be around about, actually, let's move that up. Okay, so the camera should really be in line with that level right there. So you should be able to look across the water to be about there, if that makes sense. All right, so if I scale that down. Okay, cool. So provided that that top part there is level, that should be fine. And then you don't want there to be too big of a gap between this edge there and then this, or otherwise when the simulation takes place, you'll see that this fluid drops and it kind of splashes around and stuff like that. So you might have to bake out more of the fluid simulator. But if you make it as close as possible and then use a high enough resolution of the fluid itself, then you shouldn't have too many problems of the water sloshing around and stuff like that when the simulation starts. But anyway, that's the basics of it right there. So I think if I just might scale that down just a little bit more as well. But I think now we are just about ready to start the fluid, get into the fluid settings and whatnot. Just check everything's looking good. Okay, cool. So starting with the boundary box or the domain object, which is really where most of the settings take place. So selecting that cube right there, if we go to the simulation tab up there, or the physics tab as they call it, then click on fluid, then change the type to be domain. All right, so the biggest one that you want to pay attention to is the resolution. So essentially that defines how clear and how realistic, or the resolution of the fluid. It's pretty self-explanatory. So for my final animation, I used an amount of 245 or 246, something like that. But for this particular one, I'm going to be using something low just so that we can experiment with it a little bit. I'm just going to use 85 for now just to see how it looks. And then down here underneath the fluid world, you can see you've got real world size. Now, this actually fits. So this is in meters, so that's 50 centimeters. So this fish tank, if you can imagine, it's 50 centimeters across. I'd say that's pretty accurate, so that's fine. But if this was a bigger scene, then you need to increase the meters to match that, basically. Now the fluid boundary, this is going to change sort of, so when the fluid interacts with that edge of that fish tank, it's going to change if it sort of sticks to the edge or if it slides completely off. So I'm going to make mine free slip so that you don't get any of the the water hitting it and then kind of staying there for a little bit. Now, if you've got a newer version of Blender, I think in 2.43, I'm not sure which one this is actually. Hang on, let me just have a look. Splash screen 2.63. So this is a new build, but I think the early versions, they don't have this. But there's one there that says remove air bubbles. So this is a new feature for the fluid simulator. So I'm going to uncheck that because we actually want there to be as many air bubbles as possible, because that's obviously going to make this scene look very realistic. Now down here underneath the fluid particles, I'm going to change this generate particles to be 0.1. And that's just going to create some really sort of finer and more detailed looking droplets than what is normally possible with just, the standard resolution fluid. So it's kind of like faking extra little water droplets. But if you set it too high, then it can look a little bit chaotic. I found 0.1 worked quite well for this, so that's what we're going to use. However, keep a note that whenever you use the generate particles amount there, you have to change the subdivision amount to 2 as a bare minimum. So if you don't set that to 2, then this generate particles thing won't happen basically. In fact, if it were up to me, if I was a coder, I'd make it so that this is grayed out until that is at least 2, because it's very confusing for new users, and myself included. I had no idea why this wasn't working. But anyway, subdivision 2 and then generate particles, 0.1. Now the smoothing amount, you can leave that if you want. I set mine to be 1.2. That just sort of smooths out the fluid just a little bit more than usual, so it doesn't look too kind of chaotic. For this scene, I found that 1.2 worked quite well. Everything else is pretty good. You want to set this, the file baking browser. This is essentially where it's going to save your baked files. So I'm just going to give this a new name here. I'm going to call this cache tutorial. And I'm going to hit accept. Now, whatever you set that to, like if you set a name that previously exists, so you can see I've got a few here. If you set one that previously exists like it was before, then it's going to load in that bake data for you, which is why that suddenly changed to look like fluid. Now that I've set it as a different folder, you can see that it's now snapped back to its original domain box. Now, the big one that we need to pay attention to is this one right here, the time field. So for this this animation or this simulation, we're just creating a still image. So essentially, we can get away with using a timeline of a very small amount of frames. So I'm just going to use 25 frames. Now, if this was an actual animation and you wanted it to be in slow motion and show the the fruit sort of slowly coming down into the water, then you want to set that to be quite high. Like I think I originally set one of mine to be like 350 frames, and I slowly baked it, and it was really long time to yeah, it was a lot of work. But anyway, because this is just a still image, you can get away with as few frames as possible. And essentially what that does is it saves you all of that bake time. So I'm going to set that to be 25 frames. Then you want to set this time field to match the length of this timeline right here. So I would set this end amount to be 1. Now this is in seconds. So 25 frames, if you're familiar with video footage, 25 frames make up 1 second of footage. So that's why this time field, setting it at start as 0 and then end at 1, means that it's now baking 1 second of fluid simulation. So that would mean that if you played it back in real time, it would look and behave exactly the way real fluid should. However, because this is sort of a more dramatic shot and you want to get more detail and stuff like that, I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to set this speed to be 0.3. Now actually the speed really behaves in a similar fashion to the way the time is. So in that if you set this amount here to be, I don't know, 0.3, then it would essentially be doing the exact same thing, and then if you set that to be 1. So if that makes any sense. But just for the sake of keeping things sort of accurate and the way things are, I always set the time to match exactly what's in my timeline here, and then I change this speed so that it's yeah, if I want to make something slow motion, then I just change that speed right there. So I'm setting that to be 0.3, so it's going to be essentially like 1/3 of the speed of normal fluid. And that'll just give us a lot more detail and allow us to see things and whatever, etc., etc. Okay, cool. So we've got the boundary box now set up. So you've got this little cube in the middle there, and that is of course acting as our water. So again, in the physics panel, I'm going to select fluid, then set the type to be fluid. And that's it. That's all you need to do for that. Very easy. Now these fruit objects right here, this is another important one. If you want them to be interacting with the fluid, which we do, then you also need to make them a fluid object. So selecting that line right there, I'm going to select fluid, and then from the type drop-down field, I'm going to select obstacle, like so. Now it's important also, like at one point I set, this is the slip type, sort of like how much friction the water is going to have against this. I set this to be no slip or like 0 like that, and it created like this weird vortex effect because the friction was so high on it that it was creating like this bubble around the entire thing. It was a very weird result, but I guess it's kind of accurate to the way it would happen in the real world if something was so grippy on the water, it would kind of create this vortex around it. Anyway, so point is, just leave it at 0.2. You don't need to change anything there. I just thought I'd share that random useless piece of information for you. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing for these ones right here. So that do obstacle, and then this one right here as well. Now my lemon and my lime, you can see that they've got a subsurf modifier applied to them. Now you don't need to worry about that sort of slowing down the fluid sim because there's too many vertices or anything, because the fluid sim always comes first. So it's actually just going to be operating off this basic mesh right here, and then when it renders it, it's going to have that nice subsurf look to it. So you don't need to worry about, you know, turning any of this stuff off or whatever, because it's just gonna look fine as it is. So don't worry about it. Okay, so now that we've got that set up, before obviously we start baking it, we need to animate this fruit falling into this fluid here. So essentially we want this fruit to be starting outside of the field and then slamming down there, so that on frame 25 you've got them in essentially the position that you want to be photographing them. So at frame 1 I'm going to position this orange to be about here, and I'm going to select I and then select lock and rot. So that stands for location and rotation. So it's making a keyframe for that position right there. I should also point out, by the way that we're doing this is this orange is flying down from the top left and is going to go there. This lemon is coming down straight from the top and is landing there. And then this lime is coming from the right. So essentially it creates a more nicer looking composition, because you've got splashes going from left to right, and the whole thing has got kind of bubbles and stuff happening, and it looks a lot nicer than if you had everything just drop from the top. At least that was sort of my method to the madness or whatever. So so I'm just selecting, so I've set the keyframe for that frame right there, so it's on frame 1. And also if you want to change the rotation of that orange, you can go ahead and do that right now as well. So I might position that, let's say about there. So I want this stem, that little green point right there, to be visible to the camera. So I'm setting that right there. And then on frame 25, now, oh, I didn't create the extra keyframe. All right, do that again. All right, let's move that up. Location, rotation. Now on frame 25, if you go shift left arrow, shift right arrow, it jumps from the first frame to the last frame, by the way. That's a little key shortcut for you. So on frame 25, from the camera view, I'm going to position the orange exactly where I want it to be for the final render. So something around about there should look nice. By the way, if you go down too far underneath the fluid, then what happens is the fluid bubbles actually start to separate. So if I just show you again how it was for this one right here, yeah, you get this effect right here. So as you can see, as this this text starts to separate from the surface, you can see that that fluid starts to peel away and then go towards the top there. And it looks quite ugly, and you can see that by that point, it doesn't look like a fluid simulation. It looks quite boring. So you want to get it photographed so that it's in that kind of state right there. So you want to make sure that this orange and the fruit isn't too far away from the surface, or else you won't get that, that rippling or that sort of splash effect going down underneath the surface. So somewhere about there I think should be fine. So I'm going to select I, lock and rot like that. Okay, now for this lemon slice right here, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to rotate this so that it's about there, like so, and I'm going to hit location rotation, and then frame 25, I'm going to move that down. I'm going to position that about there, and I'm going to hit location rotation. So now when we animate it, you can see that is what's happening. Final one is this lime right here. Pretty basic stuff again. Just going to move this around a little bit. Location, rotation. And then down here, just move this a little bit further. Rotate that some more. And then location, rotation again. So now you can see you've got the fruit moving into the fluid simulation like that, and it's looking kind of cool. Now when this fruit, you can see that at the start it's actually outside of the boundary box. That's actually not a problem. I originally thought it would be, and so I tried to position mine so that it wasn't, you know, so they were way out there. But I don't think it actually matters if you've got obstacles that are outside of the fluid box and then they enter into it during the animation. I think the Blender devs have done a good enough job that it doesn't really matter about that too much. Now there's one other thing. You can see that at the start of the animation that it's slow to start, so kind of like it starts and then it speeds up in the middle and then it slows down towards the end. Now, anybody that's been using Blender for more than a couple of months probably already knows the reason for that. That's because keyframes automatically have this these smoothed off, what do you call them, anchors, whatever, I guess. So a quick way to fix that, if you just select those ones right there, you can change it in two ways. You can go, if you hit V and then select vector, then you're going to be creating some harsher looking points like that, so that when this orange here starts, you can see that orange starts off really quickly and then it dips into the water there. However, you'll notice that you might have to also adjust these handles so that it kind of creates the right sort of look. So oftentimes I find it's, well, this is something I've started doing at least, is I just select S, then X, oh hang on, these ones right here, let's just change them back to be automatic, then S, X, is this even working? S, X, 0. Okay, there we go. So now you've got a lot more accurate looking fall off. So essentially it's starting off really quickly and then it's slowing down as it enters the fluid. And I actually want it to slow down as it enters the fluid because I figured that's what would happen with real fruit. If you drop it in a bucket of water, it would slow down towards the end. So that's the effect that we're going for. And I'm going to do the same with these ones right here. And you as well. And there you go. Okay, so everything else is set up. So just going over these settings again, just making sure that we've got everything the way it is. Again, I've only got my, where is it? Yeah, the final resolution. I've set that to be 85. I might actually just increase that to be, I don't know, 115, just so we can see how much resolution, a clear enough resolution that we can sort of guess if it's going the, the simulation is working or whatever. But anyway, let's go ahead, give this a bake right now. Depending on how long your machine is, it'll take longer. My machine should be done within a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to pause the recording and then we'll see how it is when we get back. Okay, so that took about 10 minutes, I guess. A little bit longer than I expected, but anyway, it's all right. You can see that the fluid simulation has baked and it's looking very, very low res. Now, the reason for that is that over here, actually I can get rid of this now. Over here in the physics panel, where it's got viewport display, it's set to be preview. So currently it's actually using this amount of resolution, 45. So if you actually change that now to be final, then what you'll see is you've got the, obviously, the more final looking fluid, which looks obviously a lot nicer. So with that fluid there selected, we can actually now just turn on smooth shading. That's going to give us obviously some smoother looking fluid. Okay, so the next step, now that the fluid simulator is baked, and we can see that actually if we just cycle through these frames here, what would you call it, that splash, that bubbling effect is, I originally wanted it to be so that it would be on frame 25 or 26 so that it works. But you could see just here where it's sort of breaking away from that line there. So I'm just going to turn it back to be maybe frame 24. I think that might be okay, or frame 23, depending on what sort of thing that we want. But that's looking pretty good. So that's looking fine. So the next step is to set up the lighting, the materials, and essentially create the final image, because the fluid simulation is now completely baked and it's ready to go. So, yeah, so for the setting up the lighting, so let me just grab the fruit. Where are the fruit? Okay, so we put the fluid on the same layer as the fruit. That was silly. Okay. I'm going to move this fluid here to be on frame number 1, right there. And I'm going to move this fruit to be on frame number 2, along with these stems as well. I've created these little stems. I'll put them on frame 2 as well. There we go. Okay, cool. So, for the lighting, I think currently we've got this big lamp overhead. We actually don't want that lamp to be exactly overhead because it's going to create some sort of unnatural looking lighting. Sort of very cold, very just, yeah, by the way, I'm moving the camera and the lamp to a different layer now just so that I can focus on the fruit. Yeah, so having an overhead light, it kind of looks like it's been shot in just an indoor area, because lighting is, especially like white lighting, like a fluorescent lamp or whatever, if it's coming directly from ahead, it just reminds people of just very bland overhead lighting from an interior. So if you have the lighting from the side, then it looks a lot more dynamic and it looks a lot better. So that's what I'm doing right now. So You can see if they've got the fluid right there. So if I just scale that down to be about that size, that should be good. So that's roughly about the same size as the width of that box there, I guess. That's good. And I'm going to set the emission amount. I'm going to set that to be 15. And I'm going to duplicate that plane. I'm going to create another one on the other side. And I'm just going to set this one to be 1. So I'll set that, make it a separate material, set that to be 1. So that one's 15 and that one is 1. So that lighting on the other side there, it's just going to give some very, very soft, very subtle highlights just on the left side so that it's not completely pitch black, because otherwise that can look a little bit bland and yeah. Okay, now for the world material, I'm going to set that to be black, just like that, so the background is now completely black as well. Now for the fluid itself, this material is actually quite easy. Just give it a surface type of glass and then set the IOR to be 1.333 or 1.33333. Yeah, I think that's right. All right, 1.333. I keep forgetting like how many numbers I say. Anyway, okay, that right there. Now the color, I'm going to set that to be white so that it's not tinted in any way. It's a solid, completely clear, transparent color. This index of refraction, by the way, the way you get that value, if you just go to Google and you type in index of refraction, then it's going to give you a list of real world values of how light bends in different things. So if you have glass, I think it's better as 1.1, and then if you have different materials, then you change that value according to that. So that's like a real world value. So you just Google what the real world value is, and then you get it. So it's kind of cool. You can just get a very accurate, very easy material just by Googling something. So that's really cool. Okay, so just having a look at the fruit itself. So if I just go to layer 2 here, and then just turn on the layer with the lamps as well. Now if I give this a render right now, we can see just how this looks with just the lights and see if we need to change anything. But that looks pretty good to me. The materials for these this fruit here is obviously already in place because we've just used that from the starter file. But I'm sure you know how to set them up. It's pretty easy, or you can just download it and have a look at how the materials are set up as well. Okay, but that's looking pretty good. So now let's give it a render with the fluid as well, and I'll just see how that looks. I'll just set the sampling. I'll change that to be 500, just so that we can get rid of a little bit more of that noise, because once you add in the fluid and stuff like that, it can get a little bit noisy a little bit quickly. So let's just have a look at that now. Alright, that's not too bad. It's pretty good. You can see that the fruit actually is, it's actually hidden underneath the fluid there. So I'll just cancel this now and I'll just show you how to correct that. Oh, by the way, you want to make sure that this box, by the way, this fluid box is not rendered ever. So this is the that fluid type object. So make sure that's on a separate layer and that it's never rendered. Otherwise, the render is just going to turn up pitch black. So just, yeah, give you a reminder of that. Alright, let's get in here. Alright. What am I doing? Where's the fruit? Select a fruit. Okay, cool. So the reason that the render looks kind of weird and looks like you've got some kind of glass bubble around it is because the fluid is actually sort of encasing it, I guess. So the way around this is just really easy. Just scale up the fruit like that. So that's what I did for mine. So I just basically baked the fluid, and then I just, once it finished baking, when it's time for rendering, I just scaled up the actual fruit objects, just like this. And that just ensures that it looks a little bit more realistic, I guess. Scale that down, and I'm going to have to move that one over a little bit as well. And because we've got keyframes, I'm actually going to have to edit it, go into edit mode and do that. Otherwise it's just going to change whenever I change a frame or whatever. Alright, and I'll scale this lime up as well. It should be the last one. You want to make sure that it's not too big, so you want to kind of get like a mix between, a few bubbles on the outside is okay, but you don't want there to be too much. So something like that should be fine. So I'll just give this another render right now, and let's see how that looks. Okay, so there you go. So as you can see, that's looking a lot nicer. The fluid is where it should be. You've got a few little bubbles on the outside there, but that's fine. That sort of adds to the effect there. So it looks quite nice. And now there's only one more thing to do, and that is where we're going to be adding in some fake bubbles. Now the reason that we're going to be adding in some fake bubbles is because currently, there aren't that many bubbles. So if you have a look at a real fruit splash photo, these are some photos that I pulled off Flickr. under the Creative Commons license for some copyright. There you go. If you have a look at some real photos right here, you can see that there are a lot of tiny little bubbles. Some of them are like tiny little specks, but they're still there because obviously when something splashes into the water, it kicks up a lot of these bubbles. If you wanted to create that level of bubbles in Blender, you would have to turn up the fluid resolution to a really insanely high amount, and even then I'm still not sure that you'd get that amount of bubbles. So the easiest and quickest way around that is to use a particle system to create particles coming off it and then create little tiny spheres to those particles and then render that basically, and it'll look obviously it looks a lot nicer. So I'm just going to go to this layer 2 here, just focusing on the fruit. This is really super easy. Just add a particle system right here. You want to set the start and the end frame to be something suitable. So the end frame is obviously 25, and the start frame should be the frame in which the fruit enters the fluid. So if I just circle through this, it's about frame 10. So I'm just going to set the start frame to be 10. So that's when the particles are going to start generating like that. There you go. So it's it's sort of raining down. It doesn't look good at all. So the next step is to change the field weights. I'm going to turn the gravity of that all the way down to 0, something I don't usually do. And I'm going to set the normal amount of that to be 0.1 and the random amount for that to be 0.5 and the Brownian amount to be 0.1 so that it kind of disperses a little bit as well. And now when you render that, you should get that effect there. I think the random amount is too much actually. Let's set that to 0.3. Let's try that again. I mean, it's a still frame anyway, so it's not really going to matter all that much if it, if the particles are moving too fast, because it's not, obviously it's not going to be visible in a still frame. Also, you've got some particles that are outside of the water there. That's okay. It doesn't matter that much because it's not really going to be that visible, because you've got a lot of splashing and stuff going up there anyway, so you're not going to be able to see those particles anyway. Now I'm actually going to set the amount of these particles to be, let's go for something a little bit higher. I'll go for 3,000. I think originally for my final image I used 1,000, but then I realized there weren't enough bubbles and didn't look realistic enough. So I went into Photoshop and I duplicated groups of bubbles, and then I started duplicating them and placing them around to essentially fake the look of more particles. So learning from my mistake, turn that up to be 3,000, and we'll go with that. Okay, cool. So obviously if we were to render that, you wouldn't see hardly anything. Oh, I'll go ahead, I'll just add these particles to these ones right here as well. Give this particle name, let's call it bubbles. Do this one here as well. And there you go. One cool thing you might have noticed is that the particle colors match the fruit because of the materials. Something, I guess, a new feature in Blender, I guess, the particles change color. I don't know, I thought it was kind of cool. Anyway, I just noticed it. Okay, so we obviously want these to be rendered as tiny little bubbles. So the way we do that is we need to create physical spheres for that to happen. So I'm going to go to a new layer, completely new layer, and I'm going to add in a UV sphere. And you want to turn down the number of these segments and stuff so that it's a lot smaller than it currently is. So I think segments of 8 and 6 will make it low poly enough that it's still a smooth looking bubble whilst still being low poly. Then I'm also going to move that up so that it is on that base origin right there, and then I'm going to rotate that by 90 degrees. The reason for that is that we're going to be creating a separate particle system soon that's going to be using the particle type of hair, so that's why we're doing that. Anyway, okay, so we've got that like that, and we want to actually create some variations of this bubble. So I'm just going to set that to smooth. I'm going to duplicate this, and now for this variation bubble, because again, having a look at those these bubbles right here, you can see some of them are like different shapes. They're kind of like oval shaped and like jellyfish shaped or whatever. I don't know if that helps, jellyfish. I don't know what image that brings to mind, but anyway. So I'm just going to go into proportional editing mode here, and I'm just going to create one of those kind of jelly bean, that's a better word for it, jelly bean shaped bubble, just like that. And that's going to make it look a little bit cooler. And then I'm going to duplicate both of those and create some smaller ones. Now for these ones here, I'm going to call this one here big 1, and then this one I'm going to call this big 2. I'm not going to bother renaming those because I'll just show you why I did this, by the way. If we go to this layer right here, I'm going to go down underneath where it says render. I'm going to change the type to be group, and then I'm going to select, I have to set them as a group first. Okay, so select all of those, hit Control G, then in the sidebar here, I'm going to set that group name to be bubbles. Okay. Alright, render. Okay, now I'm going to set that to be bubbles, like so. Now I'm going to turn down the size amount here to be, let's go 0.07, something like that should be fine. Okay, 0.007. There we go, like that. And then I'm going to turn the randomized size to be all the way up to 1 as well. And you can see those bubbles are now looking quite cool. Now I'm going to create a separate particle system, and the reason for this is that I want there to be some bubbles that are stuck to the outside. So currently there are a lot of bubbles and they look like they're stuck to it, but I want to create a few more. So I'm creating a separate particle system right here. I'm going to change the type to be hair, like that. Set the type of render type to be group, again selecting bubbles, and then I'm going to turn that size amount down to be 0.07, like so. Turn that randomized size up as well. And I think I might have to make that even smaller. Oh, actually, no, that's right. So the reason that I renamed those bubbles before, gave them different names, is I'm going to check use count. And the reason for this is so that we can now make it so that the smaller bubbles appear a lot more than the bigger ones. Because you want there to be big ones, but you don't want there to be too many of them. So I'm going to increase the amount of these smaller bubbles to be 50, like that. And then that will ensure that there are a lot more smaller bubbles than there are bigger ones, obviously. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to turn, let's go, the render type, turn the size of that down because I think that's way too much as well. Okay, a little bit more, just like that. And if you wanted to, you could also paint on, if you went into like Control Tab, you can sort of paint on here which parts of it. If you wanted like just the under part of it to have the bubbles, then you can just sort of paint like that. And then go down to the vertex groups and then select group. Also setting the, let's click advanced, then go random distribution. There you go. And then you've got the bubbles appearing where they should, I guess, but you don't have to do that. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing that I did for that one. So I'll just call this bubble static. There we go. Okay, so there we go. And then this final one here as well, bubble static, just like so. Okay, cool. So now I'm just going to go ahead, give this a render with the fluid. Everything else is in place. You got the lighting, you got everything else the way it should be. So now we give this a render, it should be ready to go. Let's see. Oh, okay, so there's one more thing. You can see those bubbles are showing up, but they're showing up as like hard clay looking objects. The reason for that is we forgot to give, or I forgot to give them a material. So just going to give it a material. Let's give it glass, and then I'll set that to be 1.33. And make sure all of them have the exact same material. So I'm going to hit Control L, then then select materials. Okay, and I can call that material type bubbles. Okay. All right, let's give that another render now. See how that looks. Alright, and there we go. So that just about sums up the tutorial. You've now got the completed scene. You got some nice splash effects. You got some bubbles. It's a little bit noisy. I only let it render for about 3 minutes, but obviously the longer you let it render, the better it's going to look. Also, of course, the fluid that I used here to save time just for this tutorial, I only set the resolution to be 115. For my final image, I used 245, which is why the fluid looks a lot more clear and cleaner here, and overall looks a lot better. But that's essentially it, guys. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the results that you guys create. So maybe some of you guys can create some different types of fruit splashes, maybe some pineapples or some bananas or other cool stuff like that. Whatever you do, if you do something cool, make sure to send me a link. Put it in the comments section below. I love seeing what you guys create with the tutorials. But other than that, that's pretty much it. You can see here I added in some extra, just a few little extra lens imperfections. So I added some like hair and stuff like that on the lens. Just in Photoshop, I just used the little paint tool and stuff like that. Just little tiny things like that to try and make it look more photorealistic. But that just about sums it up, guys. So once again, thanks very much for watching, and I will see you next time.